Hello everyone, Interact back here again with another episode of Entity Education. In this episode, we're going to be covering all of the various tracking perks for Killer and Dead by Daylight, and weighing their pros and cons, and then ranking them against each other in a tier list. Also, for the sake of convenience, I'm just going to go in the order that they appear on your perk loadout screen while your game is set to English. I will also be discussing the effects of the perks only at their maximum ranks, with the exception of one perk because behavior does weird things sometimes. Keep in mind that this tier list is based mostly on my opinion. The last tier list video that I did forever ago had some comments of people disagreeing with me, and that's completely fine. It is just my opinion after all, but do try and keep things civil. As a disclaimer, I am rating these based on how they function on their own merits and in a vacuum. Basically, I'm going to be grading them as if you're playing just a 115% killer with a 32 meter terror radius and no power whatsoever. I did ask Otstarva, perhaps you've heard of him, for his rankings on the perks and his feedback on my tier list, so a few of them got moved around from where I would have personally put them because I greatly respect his opinion. I'm also going to forego the typical S, A, B ratings, and instead put perks into the categories of ubiquitous, strong, average, niche, filler, and trash, because I feel like that gets across the point of how I feel these perks are, strength-wise, more than just the generic letters. Anyways, moving on with the video. We start off with a Nurse's Calling, because yes, it does start with the letter A, in spite of the fact that most people, myself included, just call it Nurses. A Nurse's Calling is a teachable perk from the Nurse, obviously, and is unlocked at level 40. It has a very simple and easy to understand effect. If any survivor is healing or being healed within 28 meters of you, you see their auras. So let's talk about the pros and cons for a Nurse's Calling, starting with the pros. The first pro is that this gives you perfect information in the form of auras of any healing or healed survivors. Perfect information is the best kind of information, hence why it's called perfect. You'll know exactly where the survivors are when a Nurse's Calling is on. The second pro is that a Nurse's Calling can work at any point during the match, making it a passive and reusable perk. You do need to look around and pay attention to mind your surroundings to maximize it to its full potential, but you should pretty much be doing that anyways while you're playing Killer. So let's move on to the cons for a Nurse's Calling. The first con is the range restriction. 28 meters is not that far of a distance, and is within most Killer's terror radiuses. So if survivors are wary of you running Nurses, they probably won't even bother healing while they're in your terror radius. The second con is that it only works on healing survivors. While typically survivors will be healing themselves or others during any match of Dead by Daylight, the window for Nurses to reveal them to you is actually very limited, and if they aren't healing, then the perk will just be a dead perk slot. And the final con is one that I talked about with Sloppy Butcher in the previous video on slowdown perks that I put out about a century ago at this point. Behavior keeps adding more and more ways for survivors to heal themselves outside of the normal way of either using a medkit or finding a friend. A Nurse's Calling won't be tracking anyone running inner strength, adrenaline, second wind, whatever, for their healing. So where does Nurse's Calling fall on the tier list? Given how strong the aura reading is and how frequently survivors will be healing if you're doing your job as Killer, I believe that it fits quite nicely into the strong tier. Next up we have BBQ and Chili. BBQ and Chili is a teachable perk from Leatherface, unlocked at level 35. BBQ will make it so that when you hook a survivor, all survivors outside of a 40 meter radius of the hook will have their auras revealed to you for 4 seconds. It also gives you a stackable 25% bonus to your blood points for every unique survivor you hook, meaning 100% more blood points if you manage to hook every survivor at least once. While everyone does love bonus blood points, we're going to focus on the auras for this video. So let's get into the pros and cons for BBQ, starting obviously with the pros. First pro, once again, is that auras are perfect information. I really cannot understate how good perfect information is. This will show you if survivors are on generators, healing in the corner of the map, trying to cleanse a totem, whatever, searching a chest, anything. Even if you don't see an aura, that means that they're either hiding in a locker to hide their aura, or they're close by, they're within that 40 meters of you. The second pro is that the way that you trigger BBQ is by hooking survivors. you should be hooking survivors during any given match of Dead by Daylight anyways, and knowing where to go after a hook is invaluable information for keeping your pressure up. So let's move on to the cons now. The first con for barbecue is just how often people run barbecue. A whole lot of killers are going to be running barbecue because it's just really good at helping you farm blood points to get more teachables and kind of chew through blood webs to level up multiple killers. Because of this, a lot of survivors know ways to get around the auras from barbecue, the two main ways of course being within 40 meters of the hook or hopping in a locker. The second con is that while you should be hooking survivors during the course of a match, there is a limit on how many times you'll actually be able to use barbecue during any given match. While this is pretty minor in the grander scheme of things, I don't want to leave out even the minor cons for this video. I want to be as thorough as I can. Barbecue is an interesting perk to talk about in terms of where it falls on a tier list, I think. Sure, there are ways to get around it, and some killers take better advantage of it than others, but I feel like giving you just an exact aura of where the other survivors on the map are after you hook someone is just extremely good. So I'm going to be putting barbecue in the ubiquitous tier. Next up is Bitter Murmur. Bitter Murmur is a base killer perk, meaning you can find it on any of your blood webs as soon as you start putting points into them without any teachables whatsoever. Bitter Murmur will give you the auras of any survivors within 16 meters of a generator once the generator is completed for 5 seconds. When the final generator of the match is completed, all survivors' auras on the map will be shown to you for 10 seconds. So let's discuss the pros and cons of Bitter Murmur, starting with the pros. The first pro is that it does give you perfect information in the form of auras. This means that you can see perfectly for at least a few seconds where survivors are heading after finishing a generator. The second pro is the 10 seconds of perfect information on where every survivor is when the final generator is finished. This can show you if you have a survivor already waiting on an exit gate for that last generator to pop, or whatever other information you could be wanting near the end of a match. So let's move on to the cons for Bitter Murmur. The first and biggest con, in my opinion, is the stupid black bubble that pops up when generators are completed. This bubble currently, as of the making of this video, blocks auras and lasts, oddly enough, for about 5 seconds, meaning that unless you're not far enough away to see the bubble, you won't really be able to make too much use out of the auras provided. You'll only get a few seconds of it if they run away from the bubble. The second con is that Bitter Murmur, while it does give perfect information with auras, will only ever trigger 5 times in a match. This is an extremely limiting factor, and a very big negative in my opinion. And the final con and the final nail in the coffin for Bitter Murmur for me is that it's a reactionary tracking perk, it's not proactive. You aren't able to use it to proactively find survivors to track them down and chase them. You have to wait for them to do something, in this case finishing a generator, and then the perk works for you to be able to track them down. So where does Bitter Murmur land on this tier list? Well, if bubble notifications weren't a thing, I'd probably rate it a little bit higher, but only slightly. Weighing all the pros and cons in Otz's opinion of Bitter Murmur, because he does hold it way higher than I do, I think Bitter Murmur belongs solidly in the average tier. Could do worse, but you could also do a lot better. Next up is Blood Echo, which kind of is a tracking perk, I guess. Blood Echo is a teachable perk from the Oni and is unlocked at level 35. Blood Echo will make it so that anytime you hook a survivor, all of their injured survivors will suffer from exhaustion for 45 seconds and hemorrhage until healed. This effect has a cooldown of 60 seconds. We could talk about the pros and cons of Blood Echo, but let's be honest with each other here. Blood Echo is not a very good perk in general, and if you're using hemorrhage on every other injured survivor after you hook one to track them down, we need to sit down and have a talk. Blood Echo is trash tier for tracking. Moving on, we get to Bloodhound. Bloodhound is a teachable perk from the Wraith and is unlocked at level 35. Bloodhound will make blood pools considerably more discernible, and make them also last for 4 seconds longer than they normally would. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Bloodhound, starting with the pros. The first pro to Bloodhound is just how much it actually changes the pools of blood in terms of their discernibility. They go from being pretty dark to basically just irradiated orange juice. Bloodhound makes it basically impossible to ever lose an injured survivor in a chase. The second pro is the other half of the perk, the fact that it makes the blood last longer than it normally would. This means that you'll be able to follow blood trails over longer distances than you would normally be able to. And the final pro to Bloodhound is that it can help you track survivors who are trying to remain hidden while injured and not leaving behind scratch marks by not running, and have perks like Iron Will to suppress their grunts of pain or Calm Spirit to make crows not fly up. This is a bit of a narrow case, but it can be kind of helpful in a pinch. So now let's talk about the cons for Bloodhound. The first con is that it only works for tracking injured survivors. Bloodhound will not be helping you find survivors to get your initial hit on them. On most killers, tracking survivors to get the first hit is the most important kind of tracking, and Bloodhound is not going to be helping you whatsoever with that. The second con is somewhat the same as the first. It only works on injured survivors. Most of the time, blood is not going to be your main tracking source when it comes to injured survivors. Typically, you will be using grunts of pain that survivors make while injured because a fair amount of them are pretty loud. Or you're just going to be following scratch marks because you're in a chase with them after you've hit them that initial time. So how does Bloodhound stack up against other tracking perks? In short, not so great. The fact that it only helps you track down injured survivors instead of helping you get the first few hits in is a very big downside. That, coupled with the fact that injured survivors already have a few other things that will allow you to hunt them down, means that Bloodhound is a bit redundant. I think Bloodhound belongs in the niche tier. Following that, we have Dead Man's Switch. Dead Man's Switch is a teachable perk from the Deathslinger and is unlocked at level 35. Dead Man's Switch will make it so that there is an obsession in your match, and after you hook your obsession, the perk will activate for 45 seconds. While the perk is active, anytime a survivor stops repairing a generator, the generator will become blocked and highlighted in white. So let's talk about the pros and cons for Dead Man's Switch, starting with the pros. The first major pro is that it not only gives you an idea of where survivors have been working on generators and ceased working on the generators, it will also block them from continuing to work on the generators for a pretty large chunk of time. And now let's move on to the cons for Dead Man's Switch. The first and most major con is that it only works for your obsession being hooked. Unless you have a perk build built around swapping obsessions around, you're only ever going to get this to activate 3 times in a single match, and that's assuming that you're lucky. Finding the one specific survivor that is the obsession in any given match is really a crapshoot. The second major con is that it only tells you a general area where survivors were once they stopped working on a generator. It doesn't tell you how many survivors were on the generator, which direction they went, anything like that. There's a lot of guesswork if you're using Dead Man's Switch to track survivors, and if you're pressuring the survivors off of the generator by chasing them, then you already know where they are because you can see them, and it didn't actually help you track them down at all. So how does Dead Man's Switch hold up against the other tracking perks, given that it only really gives very generalized information by telling you that a survivor was on a generator and then stopped? That, combined with the fact that it only triggers when your obsession is hooked, makes me think that it belongs in the trash tier. Next up is another perk that came out since I started writing this script what feels like about a year ago, Deathbound. Deathbound is a teachable perk from Pyramid Head and can be unlocked at level 40. Deathbound is a very confusing perk, but as with my Pyramid Head video, I'll try and explain it as best as I can. Once a survivor heals another survivor for a single health state, farther than 32 meters away from you, any survivor who finished the heal on their teammate will let out a scream, giving you 1 or more scream notifications, and activating Deathbound for 60 seconds. While Deathbound is active, if the healers move further than 8 meters away from the survivor that was healed, they will all suffer from the Oblivious status effect. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Deathbound, starting of course with the pros. The first and probably biggest pro of Deathbound is that it gives you information on where at least 2 survivors are since it doesn't trigger on self-heals. The second pro isn't really related to tracking per se, directly, but if survivors are oblivious and they're not paying attention to their surroundings, you may be able to catch them out a little bit more easily. This can make tracking them down just visually a bit easier because they won't know that they should be hiding their scratch marks or person from you because they don't hear the terror radius, but most decent survivors are going to be extra vigilant while they have the oblivious status effect. So let's move on to the cons for Deathbound. The first major con is that the scream notification, not exactly precise tracking, and it fades away after just a few seconds. Given that this perk only works if they're more than 32 meters away from you, you'll really only be getting a generalized area of where they are, and not really anything too concrete to work with. And the other con is the same as the first pro that I listed. It doesn't work on self-heals. If the survivor has a med kit, self-care, adrenaline, inner strength, whatever, the perk is just not going to trigger. I feel like Deathbound is a pretty solid inclusion in the niche tier. There are certainly worse perks that you could be running, but there are most certainly better perks that you could run if you plan on tracking down survivors. Next up, we have another Deathslinger perk, Hex Retribution. Hex Retribution can be unlocked as a teachable perk from the Deathslinger at level 40. Hex Retribution will make it so that any survivor who cleanses a dull totem will suffer from the Oblivious status effect for 45 seconds, and anytime a survivor cleanses a Hex totem, the aura of all survivors on the map will be revealed to you for 10 seconds. So let's talk about the pros and cons for Hex Retribution, starting off with the pros. The first major pro is that 10 seconds of auras on every single survivor on the map is pretty good. This is equivalent to Bitter Murmur once the final generator is finished, but this can happen closer to the start of the match, giving you much needed intel to know where to go to pressure the survivors. The second pro, once again, is that the Oblivious status effect, pretty good, might make survivors just run into you since they won't be able to hear a terror radius. Obviously their eyes will still work, hopefully their eyes will still work, and they may just see you coming in the distance. This isn't directly tracking, but you may be able to get some free hits on survivors because they don't really realize how close you are. So let's move on to the cons for Hex Retribution. The first major con is that we're looking at these perks in a vacuum. Retribution is really suited for being run with other Hex perks, and is a valuable piece of glue for bringing together those types of builds. By itself, it's just going to be a one-time 10-second aura reading that you don't really have control over, which isn't exactly something to write home about. The second major con is that some smarter survivors may cleanse Dull Totem, and then get the notification that you have Hex Retribution, and not bother touching the Hex perk, denying you of the aura reading just entirely. In this case, it's pretty much a dead perk, and dead perks are not exactly what you want to be bringing into a match with you. So where does Hex Retribution stack up on the tier list for killer tracking perks? Weighing everything together, I'm probably going to have to put Retribution in the niche tier. I think it belongs in the niche or filler tier. It's kind of hard to tell. I'm going to put it in the filler tier. For me personally, I think by itself it's maybe a niche tier, and obviously it's ubiquitous in a full Hex build, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about perks on their own. So I'll put it in the niche tier. Next up is Infectious Fright. Infectious Fright is a teachable perk from the Plague and is unlocked at level 35. Infectious Fright will make it so that anytime a survivor is put into the dying state, all survivors within the killer's terror radius will scream out and reveal their location via the scream bubble notifications for 6 seconds. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Infectious Fright, starting with the pros. The first and most obvious pro is that you will typically be getting a lot of information from this perk during a match. You should be downing survivors and putting them into the dying state pretty frequently if you're playing killer properly. The second pro is that Infectious Fright can help you out a lot with snowballing if you're planning on just leaving the survivors there and slugging them. This can turn the tide of a match in your favor almost instantaneously if it works out the way that you want it to. And the final pro is that even if Infectious Fright doesn't go off when you down a survivor, you're still gaining information. Perks that serve a double purpose like this are extremely useful. If Infectious Fright doesn't go off when you down a survivor, you know that there is no survivors in your terror radius, and you should search outside of your terror radius when you go to find another survivor. So now let's talk about the cons, or I guess the only con for Infectious Fright. The major con with Infectious Fright is that it only works on survivors inside of your terror radius. Of the currently 20 killers as of the making of this video, about 8-ish, 6 to 8-ish of them have weird quirks with their terror radiuses, whether it be that they just have smaller terror radiuses, like the Hag, or have some oddities that cause Infectious Fright to not really work on them, such as the case of Freddy, with them just being oblivious while they're in the dream world, and therefore you'll never be able to trigger it because you don't actually have a terror radius. Either way, this means that Infectious Fright isn't really a good pick for roughly like 20 to 30% of the killers in the game most of the time. I feel pretty good about Infectious Fright as a perk. I think it's extremely good. The major issue is that it doesn't work on some of those killers, but that's just due to its requirement of survivors being in your terror radius. Reviewing Infectious Fright in a vacuum is very difficult, since there are kind of two different terror radius types for killers. Given that a majority of killers are able to make a good usage out of it, I'm going to put it in the strong tier in general. Just be wary and put a little asterisk next to it that on certain killers like Freddy, it's absolutely trash tier and you should never equip it. So next up is Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden is a teachable perk from the Legion and is unlocked at level 40. Iron Maiden will make it so that you search lockers 50% faster, and also make it so any survivor who exits a locker gains the exposed status effect for 15 seconds and yells out, revealing their location for 3 seconds. If we're talking about pure tracking ability, Iron Maiden is extremely easy to put on the tier list, in the trash. As I said, if you're running this for tracking survivors, we need to have a long talk about how you think you should be tracking survivors and how exactly Dead by Daylight works. Next up is a new addition to this list, which seems to be a growing theme, given how long I've been putting off making this script. Lightborn. Lightborn will make you immune to being blinded, and reveal the aura of any survivor who attempts to blind you for 10 seconds. I'm not even really going to get into this one either. It only triggers an aura read when someone tries to blind you, and they literally have to be within your field of view for that to even be possible. This is a trash tier tracking perk. Just literally use your eyes and you can see them. Following that, we have another dubious perk, Nemesis. Nemesis is unlocked from the Oni, and it will make any survivor who blinds you or stuns you the obsession, making them suffer from the oblivious status effect for 60 seconds, and revealing their aura for 4 seconds. I would like to once again remind you that we're talking about tracking perks here. Nemesis is a fun perk for certain builds, like with Play With Your Food, for example, but 4 seconds of auras for someone who has to be close enough to either stun you or blind you, once again, is a joke. Just use your eyes. In terms of tracking, it is trash tier. In terms of fun, with Play With Your Food and other things, it's fantastic, but it's not a good tracking perk. Next up is a more concrete tracking perk, Rancor. Or Rancor, or however you want to pronounce it. People always tell me I pronounce it wrong. There's 2 ways to pronounce it. Rancor is a teachable perk from the Spirit, and is unlocked at level 40. Rancor is an obsession perk, so obviously it makes a survivor the obsession. Every time a generator is completed, a few things happen. Firstly, your aura will be revealed to the obsession for 3 seconds. Secondly, all survivors on the map will have their locations revealed to you via bubble notifications for 3 seconds. And lastly, the part that most people like to run this perk for, once all of the generators are completed, the obsession permanently gains the exposed status effect and can be moried. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Rancor, starting with the pros. The major pro is that it reveals the location of all survivors on the map. There's no range restriction or anything. This gives you near-ish perfect information of where all survivors are, so you can plan where you should be going to keep your pressure up. So moving on to the cons now. The first and most obvious con to Rancor is that it gives the obsession intel on where you are when it goes off, and warns them that you have Rancor, assuming that they know how the perk functions in the first place. The second con is that, like Bitter Murmur, Rancor has a hard limit on how many times you're actually going to get information out of it. Rancor will only ever give you these notifications a maximum of 5 times during a match. Rancor is a bit of an interesting perk to talk about in terms of tracking. It doesn't give you perfect information. With auras, it gives you good information in the form of the bubbles. On top of that, it only ever goes off 5 times during a match, but it does show you a bubble for every single survivor. There's no range restriction, or even if they're hiding in lockers, you still get it. If they're in the corner of the map, you still get it. Anything like that. Still get the bubble. It just shows you where every survivor is every time it goes off. Weighing everything together though, I think it belongs in the niche tier. So now let's talk about Spies from the Shadows. Spies is a base killer perk, meaning no teachables needed to unlock it. It'll just show up on your killer bloodwebs all the time. Spies will make it so that while you are within 36 meters of a crow when it gets disturbed by a survivor, you will get a special crow loud noise notification. And this effect has a cooldown of 5 seconds because there are lots of crows and getting spammed with notifications is really bothersome. So let's talk about the pros and cons for Spies from the Shadows, starting with the pros. The first pro is that crows are on every single map, and they're typically spread out all over the map, meaning that survivors are going to disturb them, and you'll get some usage out of it as long as you're within the range of it. So now let's talk about the cons. The first con is that crows being disturbed already make a cawing sound and fly up, giving a bunch of noise and a visual cue if you're keeping your eyes and ears open and paying attention. Giving a notification on top of that can be kind of redundant. Sometimes it will notify you of a crow being disturbed in an area where you can't see or hear because you're on like an indoor map like Hawkins, for example, but this won't really be the norm. The second con is somewhat related to the first, and that's the range restriction. Since you do have to be within 36 meters, you should typically already be able to see the crows if you're keeping your eyes out on the horizon, and you'll typically be able to hear them as well, because the sound travels a fair amount. Spies has come a long way from what it used to be. If you don't believe me, look up what the old versions used to do. It didn't even used to be a 100% chance to go off. The information it gives is somewhat near perfect, since crows will only be disturbed by survivors that are within a certain range of them, and it does give the cool crow noise notifications. But you should just be able to see and hear them normally if you've been playing killer for a while, so this perk is kind of redundant once you start actually having more time in killer. I think I'm just going to put Spies in the filler tier. The next perk up is Surveillance. Surveillance is a teachable perk from the pig and is unlocked at level 35. Surveillance will make all regressing generators become highlighted in white. Once the regression ends, meaning that a survivor has touched it, its aura will become highlighted in yellow for 16 seconds. Noises caused by survivors working on generators will also be audible at 8 meters farther than they normally are. Basically, it just makes them louder when they're working on generators. So let's talk about the pros and cons for Surveillance, starting with the pros. The first pro is that it serves a double purpose. If the generator's aura remains white, you know that no survivors have touched that generator since you started regressing it. If they've turned yellow or red since they started regressing, you know that a survivor has been in the area and touched the generator, giving you a general location of where a survivor might be. The second pro is the extra range of generator work sounds. This can help you know that a survivor is on a generator at a longer range away from the generator than normal, helping you know if you should continue moving towards that generator or not if you can't really see it. This can save you some time in a match by ruling out the generators at a farther distance than normal because you don't hear any work on them. However, this assumes that sounds are currently working in whatever the current patch of Dead by Daylight is, which is never really a guarantee, so. And the final pro is that there isn't any range restriction on Surveillance. Even if you're on the other side of the map, you can still see the generator's aura, and it will still change. Being able to gather intel at long distances, even if you aren't necessarily able to use it to its fullest, is still a bonus because it still tells you that someone did touch that generator if you see it immediately go from white to yellow. So now let's talk about the cons for Surveillance. The first con is one that is pretty common for some of these tracking perks. You do have to kind of go out of your way to make it actually function. Not only do you need to kick generators to regress them, you have to keep your eyes out for the aura color changing on the generators. You don't get an audio notification or your screen doesn't, automatically snap you to the generator when it turns from white to yellow or yellow to red. You do have to be paying attention. So where does Surveillance rank on the tier list for tracking perks? That sounded robotic as fuck. So where does Surveillance rank on the tier list for tracking perks for killers? This might bother a lot of people, since I know a lot of people for some reason really like Surveillance. I'm not really the biggest fan of it. Weighing everything together, though, I think Surveillance probably belongs in an average tier. I was originally going to put this one a bit lower, but Ott speaks pretty highly of it, so I bumped it up a little bit for him. Now back to just laughably dubious tracking perks, let's talk about Territorial Imperative. Territorial Imperative is a teachable perk from the Huntress and unlocked at level 35. It will show you a survivor's aura for 3 seconds when they enter the basement and you're at least 32 meters away. And it has a cooldown of 20 seconds. Territorial Imperative is a joke. It's in the trash tier. I'm not going to say anything else about it. Back to real perks now. Thrilling Tremors. Thrilling Tremors is a teachable perk from Ghostface and is unlocked to level 35. Thrilling Tremors will make it so that when you pick up a survivor, all generators not currently being repaired will become blocked and have their auras highlighted in white for 16 seconds. This effect has a cooldown of 60 seconds. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Thrilling Tremors, starting with the pros. The major pro is that it is fairly passive tracking. You should be downing and picking up survivors throughout the course of a match. That's just kind of how Killer plays. Unless you're super duper slugging, you should have it function multiple times before the match ends. So let's talk about the cons for Thrilling Tremors. The first con is that it is not perfect information. It only highlights, or if you want to get technical about it, it doesn't highlight generators that survivors are currently working on. It doesn't tell you if they immediately leave the generator after Thrilling Tremors has gone off, or if a survivor was standing next to a generator not working on it when Thrilling Tremors went off. Getting an idea of what generators are being worked on and where survivors are is good, don't get me wrong. The second con is the cooldown. 60 seconds is a pretty hefty cooldown for such a minor, in my opinion, effect. I guess it does need some kind of a cooldown to prevent abuse from picking up, dropping survivors to continually proc it, but 60 seconds seems really harsh. And the third and final con is that it can give you just no information at all sometimes. If you pick up a survivor and every single generator gets highlighted in white, all you've learned is that survivors aren't on generators. It doesn't give you any remote idea as to where the survivors might have been when they weren't working on those generators. So how does Thrilling Tremors line up this go around? Since it is a better tracking perk than it is a slowdown perk, and I kind of eviscerated it in the other video. The short answer is it's way better as a tracking perk than it is a slowdown perk. Obviously, what did you expect? Weighing all the pros and cons together, I think it belongs in the average tier. This is another one that Otz's opinion of kind of raised it up a little bit from where I would have put it. The cooldown is very harsh, and the intel that it gives can sometimes be nice. You can trigger it a few times during the course of a match, but sometimes it's just not going to do anything. Next up is Tinkerer. Tinkerer is a teachable perk from the Hillbilly and is unlocked at level 40. This one got recently updated as of the most recent mid-chapter patch. As of the recording of this video, I don't know how long it will take me to actually get this out, since the script only took me a year. But anyways, it got buffed. Tinkerer will make it so that when a generator reaches 70% completion, you will receive a unique noise notification. It's a little generator that floats up, and it will give you the undetectable status effect for 16 seconds. This number tweak might actually not seem like that much on paper, but it does actually double the amount of time for you knowing when the generator is near completion and when it will actually be completed. So you have double the amount of time to stop the survivors from completing that generator. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Tinkerer, starting with the pros. The first pro is that it not only shows you where a generator is getting close to being finished, meaning that there is at least one survivor working on it, it also removes your tear radius and red stain by giving you undetectable. This means that you can end chases quickly if you're across the map, because you'll be able to mind game a bit easier, as well as giving you that information on where another survivor is after you've ended that chase, or it will let you get to the generator that's being worked on and potentially get a grab or get the jump on them. The second pro is that while Tinkerer will typically only work 5 times in a match, if you do manage to regress a generator back down below 70%, it will go off again. There's not really a cooldown on it, which is nice. So let's move on to the cons for Tinkerer. The first major con is that giving you a notification that a generator is at 70% is pretty much just telling you that a generator is about to be done. It doesn't tell you how many survivors are on the generator, if they continue working on it after it triggers, or if they for some reason leave. While the buff, as I said, does give you double the amount of time to go stop them, if they're co-oping the gen with 2 or 3 or God forbid 4 people, you're not really going to be able to stop them from finishing the generator. And the second con is roughly the same as the second pro. You're probably only going to be able to get it to work 5, maybe 6 or 7 times in a match. This is a pretty limiting factor, especially given that the upside is not that great. Let me just start off by saying that I miss the old Tinkerer, where it made your add-ons better. That aside, I think Tinkerer is a pretty subpar tracking perk. Giving you a notification that you're pretty much about to lose a generator isn't a great way to track anything other than the game slipping away from you. This is another tracking perk where Ots values it a little bit more than I do. By a little bit, I mean a lot. But that being said, I'm going to put it in the niche tier. Moving on to my pride and joy, my actual son. Not literally, because by the time I've actually finished this video, my son will probably be walking already because I took forever. Anyway, Whispers. Whispers is a base killer perk, so there is no teachable needed. Whispers is a simple but extremely effective perk. Whenever there is a survivor within 32 meters of you, it will light up and you will hear, shockingly enough, whispers from the entity. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Whispers, starting with the pros. The first pro is that Whispers is the definition of a passive perk. You slap it on, and it either tells you that you're near a survivor, or you're not. You do not have to go out of your way to make this work. It will just be working the entire time during a match. There is no requirement at all other than a survivor is near you, or a survivor is not near you. The second pro is that, as I kind of hinted at, Whisper serves double duty. It tells you when you are within 32 meters of survivor, and when you are not. You can use this to rule out areas of the map, saving you a lot of time, because you know that you don't need to patrol them, because Whispers is turned off. That means there's no survivors over there. This is really the biggest reason why Whispers is such a good perk. So let's talk about the cons to Whispers. The first con is that it works on hooked and dying survivors, and also is not as good on smaller maps, especially ones like the game where there's the 2 layers. This means that during the middle of the match, when there are, down survivors, hooked survivors, you'll be losing a bit of the effectiveness of it, and you may be getting false positives. The second con is that Whispers is not technically perfect information, although we'll talk about it in a bit, but you can kind of make it perfect information. It just gives you a general area if a survivor is within 32 meters of you, or if they're not. It doesn't give you any auras or any location-based bubble notifications or anything like that. While you can essentially use it to triangulate survivors, this can be tough if they're moving, or you're not as experienced in how to actually use Whispers in this fashion. So I'm not going to bury the lead on this one. Whispers is ubiquitous tier for me. If you don't know how to use it, I would highly recommend that you check out Otofu's guide to using Whispers. I'll link it in the description, and if I remember, I'll put it in the card thing that should be on the screen right now. Watch that video. Tofu is a fantastic killer, and he goes through how to make Whispers just the best tracking perk in the game for killers. You can get so much information out of it during a match, and it will always be feeding you information even if it's turned off. Next up is another base killer perk, Deerstalker. Deerstalker is also pretty simple and easy to understand, as a lot of the base killer perks are. It will show you the aura of any survivor in the dying state while they are within 36 meters of you. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Deerstalker, starting with the pros. The first pro is that Deerstalker gives you perfect information in the form of auras. As long as a dying survivor is within 36 meters of you, you'll know precisely where they are. And if they're crawling away, or sitting still recovering, or just waiting on a teammate to heal them, you'll see them. The second pro ties somewhat into the first, and that's if you see their aura, and then it just disappears, they've been healed, or they pick themselves up with Unbreakable or Soul Guard. Either way, this gives you information on where one or possibly two survivors are, and you can just go hit the injured one and down them again, and get it to start working all over again. The first major con is that it only works on dying survivors within 36 meters of you. If you've already downed them, you can easily just pick them up and hook them, which will end up giving you information once they're unhooked anyways, and you'll know where two survivors are. Survivors also do make a fair amount of noise, assuming that sound is working in Dead by Daylight, and leave behind blood trails when they're dying and crawling around, so tracking them isn't exactly the hardest thing to do. And the other major con of Deerstalker is that it won't help you directly find any uninjured survivors, because it just doesn't do anything for uninjured survivors. You can try and use it to find people that will come save slugged survivors, but you still have to actually down a survivor for it to even start to work at all. So where exactly does one of the oldest and most classic tracking perks Deerstalker fall on the list? Since it is a narrow use case, and you can typically just track them based on the massive amounts of blood they leave, or the grunts of pain, assuming the sounds are working, I think Deerstalker is niched here. This is another one that got moved up a bit because of Otz's opinion of it. He seems to think it's much better than I do, and I don't really know why, but I'll put it in the niche tier for him. Now back to teachable perks, we have the odd one out, Discordance. Discordance is a teachable perk from the Legion, and is unlocked at level 30. Discordance is the odd perk out, of course, because it is probably the only perk in the game where its best rank is rank 1. So I'll talk about what rank 1 Discordance does. Anytime that 2 or more survivors are working on the same generator, that generator will be highlighted in yellow and will give you a loud noise notification every 8 seconds. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Discordance, starting of course with the pros. The first pro is that when Discordance goes off and the generator is highlighted, you know that you are pressuring at least 2 survivors if you go to that generator, which multi-pressure is extremely valuable as a killer. The second pro is that, of course at rank 1, it will update you every 8 seconds. This means that if it continues to go off and you hear a second or third noise notification, you know that the survivors are still working on the generator. And even if it does stop working, that means that perhaps only one survivor left the generator, and you'll still have a decent idea of where that survivor is, but there may still be one on the generator. So you still have an idea of where at least 2-ish, 1.5 survivors are. So let's move on to the con for Discordance. The major con is of course that survivors might catch on that you have Discordance because every time it goes off, because they're co-oping, the killer just starts beelining for them and they go, that's odd. And then they'll split up, and they won't be working together, and the perk will be dead. While survivors do work faster co-oping in groups, if they spread around the map and work on generators, multiple generators all at once, Discordance A isn't going to be helping you out, and B, you're going to be losing more generators because you can only really chase one survivor at a time. So how does Discordance match up against other tracking perks? I'm not really sure how to feel about the rating for this one. Sure, when it works, it gives you the ability to pressure at least 2, if not more, survivors at once, which is fantastic. But on the other hand, sometimes it just never works because survivors don't co-op gens. Weighing the pros and the cons, along with Otz's very high opinion of the perk, I think I'm going to put it into the strong tier. Following that, we have Gearhead. Gearhead is a teachable perk that can be unlocked from the Deathslinger at level 30. Gearhead will activate for 30 seconds after you've hit survivors with 2 basic attacks. While active, anytime a survivor anywhere on the map hits a good skill check while repairing a generator, the generator will be highlighted in yellow for as long as it is being repaired and as long as Gearhead is active. So let's talk about the pros and cons for Gearhead, starting with the pros. The first pro is one that I bring up fairly frequently in this video. It's a passive perk. You don't really need to babysit it unless you're playing a killer that uses their power a bunch and doesn't actually ever basic attack. It's going to be activated. And once it's active, you just kind of look around the map and you'll get an idea, maybe, if survivors are repairing certain generators. The second pro is that the aura remains yellow for as long as the survivor is repairing it while Gearhead is active. This means that it's somewhat near perfect information, since if you see it go yellow and it stays yellow, the survivor's still there. If it stops being yellow, they've left the generator, and you can search the area around it instead. So let's move on to the cons for Gearhead. The biggest con is one that you'll know right off the bat if you played the PTB. It only works on good skill checks. This means if survivors are hitting great skill checks, or not getting skill checks at all, because skill checks are RNG, you're not getting any information out of this perk. And the final nail in the coffin really is that you have to basic attack twice to get it to even start to work, and then it only lasts for a measly 30 seconds. If you've hit the same survivor twice to get it to activate, assuming that it was the same survivor and you pick them up to hook them, I've done rough calculations based on footage from my games. It takes about 10-ish seconds to get to a hook, on average. And that's a third of the perk. Just wasted, because you're carrying a survivor to a hook. And if you're activating it by hitting 2 separate survivors, you're not going to be looking around checking the color of generator auras, because you're chasing a survivor. So where does Gearhead land on the tier list compared to other tracking perks? Sadly, we do not have the PTB variant that was just better in strictly all senses, but that's in the past, we live in the present. As it stands right now, you can get some usage out of it, but basically it's just filler tier. You can do way better. Next up is another perk that got reworked since I started this script, which is becoming a running theme, Hangman's Trick. Hangman's Trick is a teachable perk from the pig, and it's unlocked at level 30. Hangman's Trick will give you a bubble loud noise notification anytime a survivor starts to sabotage a hook, and in addition, while you are carrying a survivor, the aura of any survivor within 6 meters of a hook will be revealed to you. So let's talk about the pros and cons of Hangman's Trick, starting with the pros. The first pro is that this is aura reading. On tighter packed maps, like the game, for instance, you can almost just get an aura read on basically almost every survivor on the map, because the hooks are pretty tightly packed together. The second pro is that this is pretty much passive and map-wide, since you will be carrying survivors, as I said, for roughly about 10-ish seconds while you're leading them to a hook, and if you're looking around, you might be able to get small bursts of aura reading information. But that being said, as I said with barbecue, knowing where to go to keep your pressure up after hooking a survivor is some of the best information you can get in Dead by Daylight. So let's move on to the cons now. The first major con is that on larger maps, where the hooks are spread out, like Ormond or Mother's Dwelling, you're probably just never going to be able to see any aura at all. The second major con is that you have to look around while you're carrying a survivor, while you're trying to find a hook to put them on. And this can be kind of mind-flooding to be seeing the aura of generators, hooks, and then survivors thrown in the mix as well. Be seeing a lot of red. And while survivors' auras are a different tint of red from generators and hooks, it can be kind of difficult to pick them out, especially at larger distances or on different elevations. And the final con is mostly just a gripe, but it is a valid con against the perk. While getting a notification that a survivor is starting a sabotage on a hook, that's cool and everything. With the sabo changes, if they just go through with the sabotage, the hook is going to be broken in 2.5 seconds, And guess what happens when a hook gets broken? You get a loud noise notification. So it's kind of redundant. I don't know why that's still part of this perk. So how does Hangman's trick stack up now? Kind of hard to say, because it's kind of map dependent, and 6 meters is not really that big of a distance. And hooks are coded to spawn fairly far away from each other, so there's going to be significant dead zones where you're not going to be able to see any auras at all. I think Hangman's belongs in the niche tier. It could be better like the PTB variant was, or it could be worse like the old version of it was. Next up is another default killer perk, Hex Thrill of the Hunt. Thrill of the Hunt is a base killer perk, no teachables required. Thrill of the Hunt will obviously make a Hex totem, because it's a Hex perk. For each totem that you still have remaining, you will get a few things. The first is 10% extra blood points in the Hunter category. That's not really what we're here for. The second is that survivor cleansing speed of totems will be reduced by 6% per stack. Once again, not really what we're here for. The final thing, and the one that we're looking for, is that you will get a loud noise notification whenever a survivor begins cleansing a Hex totem. So, pros and cons. The pro is that Thrill basically gives you perfect information, since the bubble notification will always be on your Hex totem, meaning you know exactly where they are, and if they keep restarting the cleanse for some reason, you will keep getting a bubble notification, so you'll know that they've continually touched it. Now, the cons. Now, I'm going to say that this perk is fine in certain builds, but as I've stated multiple times, I'm rating them based on their own merits, not on how they work in a build. On their own, I don't know why you'd be running it. So, I mean, people might leave comments about this, but in a vacuum, Thrill is just a joke. It's trash tier in terms of tracking. It's great in Hex builds, like with Retribution, but on its own, it's a joke. Next up is I'm all ears, which is really awkward to say, because it's like a phrase, it's not just a... Anyways, I'm all ears is a teachable perk from Ghostface and is unlocked at level 30. I'm all ears will give you the aura of a survivor who performs a rushed action within 48 meters of you for 6 seconds. This effect has a cooldown of 40 seconds. So let's talk about the pros and cons of I'm all ears. The first pro is that I'm all ears gives perfect information in the form of an aura, and it lasts for 6 seconds. 6 seconds is a pretty decent amount of time, and is very useful in a chase to know exactly what direction a survivor is going after they've vaulted a window or hopped out of a locker, or vaulted over a pallet. So let's discuss the cons now. The first con is that it has a 40-second cooldown. 40 seconds can be the difference between it triggering just once in a chase, and it working more than once. If the cooldown was 20 seconds, you'd probably be able to get it to work more than once in a chase. The second con is that I'm all ears is not actually going to find you a survivor to start a chase with. It really only comes into play mid-chase and helps you end the chase a little bit faster. The third con is that it only works on rushed actions, meaning if the survivor is trying to be sneaky, or has quick and quiet, or doesn't have any windows to work with, you're not really going to be getting the aura mid-chase. So where does I'm all ears fall in the tier list? Well, it's a bit of a difficult one to talk about. Firstly, because saying I'm all ears in a sentence sounds really awkward. Behavior don't name perks entire phrases, it makes things sound really weird when I'm scripting them out. I'm all ears has a solid effect. It does give you that perfect information. My main issue with it is the large cooldown, and then it doesn't help you start chases. It mostly just helps you end chases. However, given that it does help you end chases fairly quickly via moonwalking or ranged attacks on certain killers, I think I'm just going to put it in the strong tier. This is another one, again, that Ots has a very high opinion of, so... let's talk about Predator. Predator is a teachable perk from the Wraith and is unlocked at level 30. Predator will make scratch marks spawn considerably closer together. So let's talk about it. There isn't really any pros for Predator. I'll put up on screen a comparison between what scratch marks look like with and without Predator, so you have an idea of what it is I'm talking about. The major issue, in case you can't spot it right away, is that Predator just removes Scratch Mark's ability to spawn on walls or trees or drop downs, literally anything that isn't the ground. So you're not going to be able to see them at a distance, which is a really good benefit of Scratch Marks. This means that Predator will actively hamper your ability to track survivors over distances, which, as I said, one of the main benefits of Scratch Marks is that you can see them a ways away. Sure, it makes, following the yellow brick road really easy once you've actually found a survivor, because it is just a little line that leads to a survivor, but it actively harms you outside of that chase, which is worse than making it easier to follow somebody that you can probably already see with your eyes. So let's just put Predator where it belongs in the garbage and move on to talking about other tracking perks. Next up is another base killer perk, Sloppy Butcher. Sloppy Butcher will make your basic attacks apply Mangled and Hemorrhage to the survivors. It will also considerably increase their bleeding frequency. All this essentially means is that survivors will take longer to heal and leave behind more blood when they're injured. The pros of Sloppy Butcher is that by having Mangled, it may encourage the survivors to stay injured, since their healing times will be slower. This means that you may actually be able to use the extra blood pools to track them down a bit easier if they're trying to be sneaky. The second pro is that if they are staying injured, due to the increased healing time, Grunts of Pain will also be an easier way to track them. This is kind of an indirect way that Sloppy will help you track, but it is kind of a way that will help you. Honestly though, I'd say that Sloppy is really more of a game slowdown perk than it is a tracking perk. While it does have the aspect of increasing how frequently they leave the blood behind them, it won't actually help you find any uninjured survivors, which is far more important than finding injured survivors. All that being said, how does it stack up against the other perks? To be quite honest, could be better. It might be able to be worse. I think it's probably just bottom of the filler tier. And the final major killer tracking perk that we're going to get into is Stridor. Stridor is a teachable perk from the nurse and is unlocked at level 30. Stridor will make Grunts of Pain of injured survivors 50% louder, and make their regular uninjured breathing 25% louder. The main pro is that it not only makes injured survivor tracking easier, it also helps you find survivors before you hit them, kind of, since it does make their normal breathing louder, but it still can be difficult to hear, with all the ambient noise in the background. However, helping find both injured and uninjured survivors is a big plus for any tracking perk. So let's move on to the cons. The first con is more of a preference thing technically, but for me, and I know for other people that I've talked to as well, it really messes with the muscle memory, or oral memory, or whatever you want to call it, of how far away survivors are based on their injury sounds. This might not really affect some people, but I know for me it screws me over way more than any benefit I could ever get out of Stridor. And the second is more of an actual con, but survivors can hear themselves breathing louder when the match starts, so if they're paying attention, they'll know that you have Stridor, and they'll play around it if they can. Whether that be by not staying injured for as long or what have you. But basically it gives itself away right out of the gate. Putting my bias against Stridor aside, where do I think it ranks on a tier list? It's a big plus that it helps you with not only injured survivor tracking, but also uninjured survivor tracking. That being said, I do think the downside of messing with the normal distance to loudness sound is a pretty big negative. I think it belongs in the niche tier, but personally I never run it. It's trash for me. Now let's talk about some honorable mentions, dishonorable mentions, for perks that aren't really tracking perks, but have some tracking aspect to them, kind of. The first one that I'm going to mention is Bloodwarden. Bloodwarden is a teachable perk from the Nightmare, Freddy Krueger, and it will show you the aura of survivors while they are in the exit gates, and also once per trial while an exit gate is open. If you hook a survivor, the exits will become blocked for 60 seconds. This technically gives you information on where survivors are, but only if they're sitting in the exit gates and once they're opened, and at that point they're probably just gonna leave. Plus the auras aren't really, if you're bringing Bloodwarden for the aura aspect of it, I need to have a chat with you because you're a psychopath. I'm not even going to bother putting this on the tier list. It's going straight in the garbage right alongside Predator. The other honorable-ish mentions fall into two categories: larger FOV or field of view perks and skill check nonsense. So we'll start with the larger FOV perks. There is of course Monitor and Abuse, which is a teachable perk from the Doctor, and Shadowborn, which is a teachable perk from the Wraith. Both of these perks will increase your field of view. Monitor will only do it when you are not in a chase, Shadowborn does it all the time. And while an increased FOV does let you see more on your screen, which technically lets you potentially spot survivors that would be in your peripheral vision that you wouldn't normally see, I don't really think they're tracking perks. I think they're more of utility perks. And I'll discuss them more in detail whenever I make that video in 10 years. The other perks that I mentioned, the skill check nonsense perks, sorry, it's been a very long recording, are Hex Huntress's Lullaby and Unnerving Presence. Hex Huntress Lullaby is, shockingly enough, a teachable perk from the Huntress, and Unnerving Presence is a teachable perk from the Trapper. While these do make skill checks harder, air quotes, making survivors potentially fail them more regularly, which will give you more loud noise notifications, I don't think either one of them is good enough to bother using to track survivors. Like, at all. And that's it for this episode of Entity Education, covering, ranking, and putting on a tier list all of the tracking perks for killers in Dead by Daylight as of the making of this video. If you enjoyed this video and learned some things, or maybe even changed your mind about some perks, or you disagree with me, feel free to leave a like, leave a comment, telling me what you disagree with, what perks you would put where on the tier list. Do keep in mind that I was rating them based on their own merits, on a generic, hypothetical, non-existent 115% killer without a power and a 32-meter tear radius, basically Trapper if you unbound Mouse 2. And not how they functioned in like one specific build or for one specific killer. So keep that in mind, and as always, as I said, please be civil in the comments. Thank you as always for watching. All the links to social media stuff up on the screen in the description. Do check out Tofu's video on Whispers if you want to get better with Whispers. And I will see you in the next video of this series, which will be covering the anti-looping, anti-chasing, I guess, perks for killers, which at the current pace that I'm doing these will be out in 2022. Goodbye.